The chains around Adeline Mercer's wrists were lighter than the silence that followed her through the rain, because everyone in Northvale believed a cursed Omega deserved to be carried to death without a single voice raised in protest. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in courage and destiny, hit like and subscribe. These stories remind us, love finds the broken. Now, back to Adeline. The road to Blackthorn's citadel climbed through towering pines wrapped in silver mist, their branches bending beneath a relentless autumn storm. Inside the prison wagon, Adeline sat with her hands folded across the faded gray cloak that had belonged to her late mother. Beneath its worn fabric rested the only thing she had managed to keep, a narrow silver ribbon tied carefully around her wrist. She touched it with trembling fingers whenever fear threatened to steal her breath. Across from her, Margaret Mercer refused to meet her eyes. The older woman had signed the royal decree only hours earlier, exchanging her niece for the promise that the Mercer family would be spared from exile. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered at last, though the words sounded too small against the pounding rain. "The council said the kingdom cannot survive another winter unless the offering is made." Adeline managed a faint smile that hurt more than tears. "Then I hope they find what they're looking for." She did not ask why it had to be her. She had stopped asking questions years ago, after every strange illness, failed harvest, and unexplained death in the valley had somehow become her fault. The gates of Blackthorn's citadel rose from the mountains like the ribs of some ancient beast. Black stone towers disappeared into low clouds while hundreds of torches flickered against walls carved with forgotten wolves and crowned kings whose names no one dared speak aloud. Soldiers lined the courtyard in absolute silence as the wagon rolled to a halt. Captain Nathaniel Brooks stepped forward first. His polished armor reflected the firelight, yet his expression carried none of the satisfaction Adeline expected from the man escorting a sacrifice. Instead, he unlocked her chains with careful hands and quietly said, "Walk beside me. No one will drag you." She nodded, surprised by the unexpected kindness. It was the first gentle sentence directed toward her in longer than she could remember. Inside the grand hall, nobles gathered beneath enormous banners stitched with the black wolf of House Ashcroft. Their whispers flowed like cold wine through dry leaves. "That's the cursed girl. She looks ordinary. The throne will know the difference." At the far end of the chamber stood an enormous pair of iron doors sealed with ancient symbols worn smooth by centuries. No one looked directly at them. Even the loudest voices lowered into uneasy murmurs whenever their eyes drifted toward the entrance. High Chancellor Edmund Harrow stepped into the center of the hall, his crimson robes sweeping across polished stone. His voice carried with practiced certainty. "By the authority of the crown and the sacred covenant, Adeline Mercer shall be offered to the throne of forgotten kings before tomorrow's moon reaches its highest point. Through this sacrifice, the kingdom shall remain protected." A murmur of approval rippled through the nobles. Adeline lowered her head, not from obedience, but because she suddenly understood that no one present cared whether she was innocent. They needed someone to fear, and she had worn that burden all her life. Then every conversation stopped. Heavy doors opened behind the throne, and a single figure emerged from the darkness. Alpha King Silas Ashcroft crossed the chamber with measured steps, dressed entirely in black. His silver-blue eyes swept over the assembly before resting on Adeline for only a heartbeat. His face revealed nothing. Yet as he approached the ancient doors, the black obsidian band wrapped around his wrist caught the torchlight, and for the briefest instant, a thin crack of crimson light pulsed beneath its surface. Silas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. No one else seemed to notice. But far beyond the sealed iron doors, somewhere inside the forgotten chamber, where generations of kings had vanished into legend, something answered with a low, distant sound that felt less like stone shifting, and more like someone taking their first breath after centuries of silence. The low, haunting sound that rolled through Blackthorn's citadel did not fade like distant thunder. It lingered beneath the stone, slow and steady, as though something buried beneath the mountain had awakened after centuries of silence. Adeline Mercer stood frozen in the center of the grand hall, while nobles glanced around uneasily, each pretending they had heard nothing at all. Only Alpha King Silas Ashcroft remained perfectly still. For the briefest instant, his silver-blue eyes met hers, and the fractured obsidian band around his wrist pulsed with a crimson glow before disappearing beneath the sleeve of his black coat. Whatever had answered from beyond the sealed doors, it had recognized them both. "Take the girl away," High Chancellor Edmund Harrow ordered sharply, his voice cutting through the uneasy silence before questions could spread across the court. Captain Nathaniel Brooks stepped forward, unlocking the last of Adeline's restraints himself instead of allowing the guards to drag her. "Walk with me," he said quietly. "You'll keep your dignity that way." The unexpected kindness almost unraveled her composure. She lifted her chin and followed him through endless corridors carved from black granite polished by generations of forgotten footsteps. Portraits of ancient kings lined the walls, yet something about them unsettled her. Every ruler rested one hand upon the same dark throne, but none looked proud. They looked burdened. As they descended toward the oldest wing of the citadel, the air gradually warmed instead of cooling. Nathaniel slowed. "No one comes here unless commanded," he murmured. "If you hear strange things tonight, stay inside your room." Adeline searched his face. "Have you heard them?" For the first time, the captain hesitated. Every guard who has served this corridor has heard something. He looked toward the distant passage before lowering his voice even further. Each one heard something different. He said nothing more. Her chamber overlooked the northern cliffs where rain drifted across endless forests swallowed by mist. It was simple but unexpectedly comfortable. Fresh bread and warm soup waited untouched on the table. Adeline sat beside the narrow window, unable to eat. Her thoughts kept returning to the ancient doors and the strange pulse beneath the King's Oath band. If she truly carried a curse, why had the throne answered before she had even crossed its threshold? Midnight settled over the mountain. The wind outside faded until an unnatural stillness covered the fortress. Then came the whisper, not through the air, through the stone beneath her feet. It was neither threatening nor pleading. It sounded almost lonely. Before she realized she had moved, Adeline stood outside her chamber with only a lantern borrowed from the wall. The guards posted outside were gone. Their spears remained leaning against the stone as though abandoned in haste. She followed the whisper through empty corridors where every torch flickered in the same slow rhythm as the sound beneath the floor. Around one final corner, she stopped. Before her stood another pair of towering doors far older than the entrance she had seen inside the grand hall. Deep cracks crossed the ancient iron, and faint crimson light pulsed beneath them like the heartbeat of the mountain itself. As Adeline instinctively reached toward the weathered surface, another hand gently caught her wrist before her fingers made contact. She spun around with a gasp. An elderly man stood beside her carrying a small brass lantern whose warm light somehow softened the oppressive darkness. "Some doors," he said gently. "Remember every soul that has ever stood before them." His eyes settled on the faded silver ribbon tied around Adeline's wrist. "And some souls are remembered long before they arrive." "Who are you?" she whispered. "Theodore Hale." He inclined his head. "I have watched over this hall longer than most people in this palace have been alive." He released her wrist and turned toward the ancient doors with quiet reverence. "People believe the throne of forgotten kings hungers for cursed blood." His voice carried neither fear nor certainty. Belief and truth have not walked together in this kingdom for a very long time. Adeline's heart pounded. "Am I going to die tomorrow?" Theodore did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied the ribbon around her wrist with an expression that looked painfully familiar, almost as though he were remembering someone else. "That," he finally said, "depends on whether the throne still remembers what men have tried so hard to make it forget." Before Adeline could ask another question, hurried footsteps echoed through the corridor. Theodore's calm expression changed for the first time. "Go," he urged softly. "And whatever calls your name tomorrow, do not answer out of fear." He stepped backward into the shadows just as Captain Nathaniel rounded the corner with 4 royal guards. Relief flashed across his face when he found her unharmed. "Lady Mercer," he said, almost breathless, "the palace has been searching everywhere for you." He escorted her back without another word, but halfway through the corridor both of them froze. Far below the castle, deep beneath layers of ancient stone, a heavy sound echoed once more. Not a roar, not an earthquake, a heartbeat. At that exact moment, inside the royal chapel above, Silas Ashcroft gripped the altar as agony shot through his arm. A second crimson fracture split the obsidian oath band across his wrist. He stared at it in silence, because for the first time since becoming king, the ancient oath was no longer binding him. It was warning him. Morning broke beneath a sky of heavy gray clouds, but inside Blackthorn's citadel the day began with polished marble, glittering silver, and carefully practiced smiles that never reached anyone's eyes. Adeline Mercer stood quietly as Captain Nathaniel Brooks escorted her into the upper court. The whispers started before she crossed the doorway. That's the cursed Omega. She looks ordinary. That's how misfortune always hides. She had heard words like them her entire life. They no longer pierced her heart as sharply as the silence that always followed. Nathaniel remained one respectful step behind her. He neither hurried nor restrained her, a small kindness that did not go unnoticed by several watching servants. At the center of the court stood Vivian Holloway, radiant in a sapphire gown embroidered with silver thread, every detail announcing the daughter of one of North Vale's oldest noble houses. She had spent her entire life preparing to stand beside a king. Yet this morning, every conversation revolved around a frightened Omega from a forgotten village. The attention unsettled her far more than she wished to admit. Vivian approached with measured elegance, her smile flawless. "So," she said, circling Adeline slowly, "this is the girl everyone suddenly pities." Adeline met her gaze without hostility. "I'm not asking for pity." Vivian gave a soft laugh. "No, you're asking us to believe you're harmless." She turned slightly, making certain the surrounding nobles could hear every word. "Do you know why people fear cursed Omegas? Because every famine, every plague, every failed harvest in our history began with someone insisting an innocent girl couldn't possibly be dangerous." A quiet murmur of agreement spread through the court. For the first time, Adeline saw something beneath Vivian's arrogance. It was fear, not fear of losing status, but fear of repeating stories she had been taught since childhood. Vivian genuinely believed that allowing one cursed Omega to live might condemn thousands. "If you believe that," Adeline said gently, "then you've been carrying a very heavy burden." The unexpected answer caught Vivian completely off guard. She had prepared herself for tears, anger, even defiance. Compassion had never crossed her mind. Before she could recover, a sudden crash shattered the fragile calm. A young servant carrying a silver tray stumbled over the edge of a carpet. Crystal goblets exploded across the marble floor, and a kettle of steaming herbal tea overturned across the girl's bare hands. She cried out in pain before immediately trying to gather the broken glass herself. "Don't just kneel there," a steward barked. "His Majesty's guests arrive within the hour." The terrified servant apologized through tears while trying to ignore the burns spreading across her skin. No noble moved to help. One woman even stepped backward to keep her gown from touching the spilled tea. Adeline crossed the room without hesitation. She knelt beside the servant and carefully lifted the trembling hands into her own. "Look at me," she whispered. The frightened girl obeyed. "Take one slow breath." Around them, conversation gradually faded. Adeline closed her eyes, remembering evenings when her own mother had soothed frightened children simply by refusing to let them feel alone. She spoke softly, not with spells or prayers, but with quiet reassurance. "You're safe. Breathe with me." The servant's panicked breathing slowed. Her trembling eased. The angry redness remained, yet the sharp agony gradually softened enough for her to uncurl her fingers. She stared at Adeline in astonishment. It doesn't hurt like before." Adeline smiled gently. "It will still need medicine, but you're going to be all right." An uneasy silence settled over the court. There had been no flash of magic, no miracle, only kindness offered without expecting anything in return. Several servants exchanged uncertain glances. A few lowered their heads, suddenly ashamed they had not moved first. Vivian watched everything unfold in troubled silence. This wasn't the monster she had spent years imagining. It was simply a woman who instinctively comforted someone weaker than herself. At that moment, the great doors opened. Alpha King Silas Ashcroft entered beside High Chancellor Edmund Harrow. His gaze immediately found the gathering around the injured servant. "What happened?" Edmund asked sharply. Before the steward could answer, the servant herself stepped forward despite the pain still lingering in her hands. "She helped me," the girl said, bowing toward Adeline. "Everyone else was afraid to touch me, but she wasn't." Edmund's expression hardened. "Lady Mercer, Your role is not to interfere with palace order. Adeline slowly rose to her feet. She was suffering. Servants can be replaced, Edmund replied coldly. The kingdom cannot. The words echoed through the silent chamber. Silas said nothing, but his eyes remained fixed on the servant's hands. He had seen burns severe enough to leave permanent scars. Now the girl flexed her fingers with only slight discomfort. More importantly, he had seen every noble remain still while the kingdom's supposed curse had been the first to kneel. As the court dispersed, Nathaniel quietly approached the king on the palace balcony overlooking the northern cliffs. Your Majesty, he said carefully, I've guarded warriors all my life. He glanced back toward the hall where Adeline disappeared with the attendants. I've never seen courage look so gentle. Silas remained silent for several moments before answering. Neither have I. Far below the citadel, hidden beneath layers of ancient stone, the throne of forgotten kings answered with another slow heartbeat, as though something older than memory had just recognized the difference between power that demanded obedience and strength that chose compassion. The heartbeat beneath Blackthorn's citadel did not stop when dawn came. It followed every corridor, every stone wall, every whispered conversation, until the entire palace seemed to breathe with a life older than the kingdom itself. No one spoke openly about it, yet servants crossed themselves before entering the lower halls, and even seasoned guards avoided looking toward the sealed passage beneath the throne. Fear had begun spreading faster than rumor. Inside the Hall of Sovereigns, Alpha King Silas Ashcroft faced the royal council alone. Rain lashed against the towering windows while the oldest families of North Vale watched him in absolute silence. At the center of the chamber stood High Chancellor Edmund Harrow, one weathered hand resting upon an ancient chest bound with black iron. Your Majesty, Edmund began. Before tomorrow's ceremony, the crown must renew its understanding of the 4 royal oaths. He lifted 4 brittle parchments, their faded seals bearing the marks of generations long dead. Every king before you accepted these without hesitation. Silas remained standing instead of taking his throne. Then perhaps every king before me failed to ask the right questions. A ripple of unease moved through the council. Edmund unfolded the first parchment. The king shall protect the throne of forgotten kings. The second followed. The king shall preserve the sacred covenant. The third. The king shall uphold the blood law above personal desire. Finally, the fourth. The king shall never interfere with the chosen offering. The words settled over the chamber like chains. Edmund looked directly into Silas's eyes. These oaths preserved North Vale for 3 centuries. Silas's fingers tightened around the arm of his chair. Or so I've been told. He descended the steps slowly until he stood face to face with the chancellor. Tell me something, Edmund. How many kingdoms fell because a king spared an innocent woman? No one answered. How many survived because she died? Still, only silence. Edmund's voice grew quieter. Some questions cannot be answered with numbers. Then answer them with names. Silas reached beneath his cloak and placed the weathered archive ledger upon the council table. Dust rose as it landed. I found this beneath the palace. Several counselors exchanged alarmed glances. Edmund did not. You entered the restricted archives. I did. Silas opened the ledger. Hundreds of women were brought before the throne. He turned page after page, revealing only the same chilling words repeated again and again. Records sealed by order of the royal council. Not one explanation. Not one witness. Only erased histories. The chamber grew painfully still. Edmund slowly closed the book. Some knowledge exists to protect the living. Or those in power, Silas replied. For the first time since his coronation, open distrust stood between king and council. Edmund took one measured step closer. His voice remained calm, but grief flickered beneath its certainty. When I was a boy, my father taught me that rulers are sometimes forced to choose between one innocent life and 10,000 others. Every generation before yours accepted that burden. His eyes did not waver. If the covenant is abandoned and this kingdom falls, history will remember that it happened because one king loved mercy more than duty. The words struck deeper than accusation because Silas heard genuine conviction within them. Edmund was not protecting himself alone. He truly believed the sacrifice preserved the realm. That belief made him far more dangerous than a man driven only by ambition. Hours later, Silas descended alone into the forgotten archives. The deeper he walked beneath the citadel, the heavier the air became until breathing itself felt difficult. Theodore Hale waited beside a single lantern, as though he had known the king would come. "You already knew?" Silas said quietly. Theodore nodded. "I knew the records had been erased. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because truth cannot simply be handed to a king." The old keeper's gaze settled on the obsidian band circling Silas's wrist. Another crimson fracture had spread across its surface since the previous night. He must choose whether he wants it badly enough to pay for it. Silas looked down at the cracked band. "Everyone tells me the kingdom will fall if I break these oaths." Theodore remained silent for several moments before answering. "Sometimes kingdoms survive because a king keeps his promises." He gently lifted the lantern, illuminating shelves filled with forgotten names. "Sometimes they survive because he refuses to keep the wrong ones." Before Silas could respond, the mountain itself trembled. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Far above, inside her quiet chamber, Adeline Mercer instinctively knelt as warmth spread through the stone beneath her feet. Crimson lines emerged across the floor once again, but this time they did not stop there. They climbed the walls in delicate branching patterns before converging beneath the faded silver ribbon around her wrist. She stared in stunned silence as the ribbon shimmered softly, answering something hidden deep below the castle. At that exact moment, Silas felt the obsidian band tighten with crushing force until fresh blood slipped between his fingers. He understood at last that the ancient oath was no longer merely binding him. It was demanding a choice, and whichever path he chose, neither he nor his kingdom would ever be able to return to what they had been before. The crimson patterns disappeared from the walls almost as quickly as they had appeared, yet nothing inside Blackthorn's citadel felt ordinary anymore. Every servant walked with lowered voices. Every guard glanced uneasily toward the oldest wing of the palace. Even the mountain itself seemed to wait. In her chamber, Adeline Mercer sat beside the narrow window, watching the last light of afternoon fade beyond the endless forests of North Vale. The silver ribbon around her wrist rested against the old clasp Theodore Hale had returned to her, and although both now appeared lifeless, she could still remember the warmth that had passed between them only moments before. A gentle knock broke the silence. Theodore entered carrying his familiar lantern, but tonight his face looked older than before, as though every secret he had protected for decades had grown heavier with each passing hour. Without speaking, he placed a small wooden box upon the table. Inside lay a faded parchment folded so many times that its edges had nearly crumbled away. "Your mother asked me to keep this," he said quietly. Adeline unfolded it with trembling hands. The handwriting was elegant despite the fading ink. Asterisk, if my daughter ever stands before the throne, tell her she was never born carrying a curse. She was born carrying the truth others were too afraid to face. Asterisk, tears blurred Adeline's vision. She survived the throne. Theodore nodded. She did. His voice softened with memory. When the throne refused to take her, the council feared what that meant. They forced her into silence. She left the citadel to protect you from the same fate. He paused before continuing. She spent the rest of her life hiding from those who would have brought her back here. Illness claimed her years later, but she never allowed them to find you. Adeline closed her eyes, clutching the letter against her heart. For years she had believed her mother died, carrying shame. Now she understood that the woman she had mourned had spent her final years carrying hope instead. Theodore gently closed the wooden box. Tomorrow, they will try to finish what they began with her. Before he could say more, hurried footsteps echoed through the corridor. Nathaniel Brooks appeared at the doorway, his expression unusually tense. "The procession has been moved forward," he said. "The Chancellor insists the ceremony begins at sunset tomorrow." Theodore frowned. "He's afraid." Nathaniel nodded once. "The palace can feel the throne awakening." After Theodore departed, Nathaniel remained behind. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, he looked directly at Adeline. "There may still be a way out." She frowned slightly. Nathaniel stepped closer, lowering his voice until only she could hear. "At dawn tomorrow, I'll be responsible for changing the Eastern Watch. The old forest gate will be unguarded for less than 2 minutes." He swallowed before finishing. "If you leave then, no one will catch you before sunrise." Adeline stared at him in silence. It was the first real chance she had been given since arriving at the Citadel. Freedom stood only one decision away. "Why would you help me?" she asked softly. Nathaniel answered without hesitation. "Because protecting the innocent matters more than protecting a tradition I no longer understand." Long after he had gone, Adeline remained alone with the impossible choice. She walked to the window, overlooking the dark forest stretching beyond the palace walls. Somewhere beyond them waited safety, anonymity, perhaps even a peaceful life. Yet another thought slowly settled inside her heart. If she escaped, the council would simply search for another frightened Omega, another daughter, another family. The throne would remain surrounded by lies. She quietly untied the silver ribbon from her wrist before fastening it again with greater care, as though renewing a promise no one else could hear. "I'm not running, Mother," she whispered into the gathering darkness. "Not if someone else has to stand here after me." At that same moment, Alpha King Silas Ashcroft stood alone inside the royal chapel. Moonlight spilled across the ancient altar while blood from the fractured obsidian oath band dripped steadily onto the stone floor. He had spent the entire night reading the erased histories, searching for one reason to believe the council was right. He had found none. Instead, he found only silence where truth should have been. The chapel doors opened. Edmund Harrow entered without announcement. "Your Majesty," he said, "the council has finalized tomorrow's rite." Silas did not turn. "Without my consent. The covenant does not require it." Edmund's voice remained calm. "It requires only your obedience." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Silas looked down at the blood staining his hand. "And if I refuse?" Edmund answered with absolute certainty. "Then you will not merely lose your crown." His eyes settled upon the cracked obsidian band. "You will become the king who destroyed North Vale." After Edmund departed, Silas remained alone beneath the silent chapel ceiling. He slowly closed his bleeding hand, feeling the ancient oath tighten once more around his wrist. Far below, hidden beneath centuries of stone, the throne of forgotten kings answered with another slow heartbeat. Above, in separate wings of the palace, both the king and the cursed Omega reached the same decision without speaking to one another. Neither of them would run. And with that choice, the path ahead ceased to belong to fate alone. It belonged to them. By the time the last light disappeared behind the snow-covered peaks, Blackthorn's citadel no longer felt like a royal palace. It felt like a place holding its breath. Torches along the oldest corridors were extinguished one after another until only a narrow path of flickering flames remained, leading toward the throne hall. Servants whispered instead of speaking. Soldiers checked their weapons in uneasy silence, though none of them could explain why battle seemed closer than any ceremony. Inside her chamber, Adeline Mercer stood before a small mirror while two attendants carefully fastened the final clasp of a simple white ceremonial gown. Delicate silver embroidery traced the sleeves like running wolves beneath moonlight. Neither woman could bring herself to meet Adeline's eyes. As they stepped away, the younger attendant quietly pressed a folded handkerchief into her own palm, embarrassed by the tears she could no longer hide. "My grandmother used to pray for the girls who were brought here," she whispered. "She said they deserved to be remembered." Adeline offered a gentle smile despite the fear tightening inside her chest. "Then remember them," she replied softly. "That will matter more than remembering me." A quiet knock interrupted the moment. Theodore Hale entered carrying his familiar lantern, its warm light pushing back the shadows gathering inside the room. He looked at Adeline for several long seconds before speaking. "Your mother stood where you stand now." He unfolded the weathered letter she had already read, his finger resting on one final line hidden beneath the others. Asterisk, when fear tells you to kneel, lift your eyes instead. Asterisk. Theodore carefully folded the parchment again. She did not survive because she was stronger than everyone else. His tired eyes met Adeline's. She survived because she refused to let fear decide who she would become. Before Adeline could answer, distant bells echoed through the palace. The ceremony had begun. Captain Nathaniel Brooks arrived moments later wearing formal black armor instead of battle gear. Unlike the guards behind him, he carried no drawn weapon. "It's time," he said quietly. They walked through corridors lined with nobles and servants who instinctively stepped aside. No one jeered. No one celebrated. Several lowered their heads as Adeline passed, and for the first time since entering Blackthorn Citadel, she realized the silence surrounding her no longer belonged only to fear. It carried doubt. High above, Vivian Holloway watched from an overlooking gallery, her sapphire gloves clenched tightly in her hands. The certainty she had carried since childhood had begun to fracture. If Adeline truly was a monster, why did every act of kindness inside the palace belong to her? Inside the throne hall, Alpha King Silas Ashcroft stood before the ancient throne dressed in ceremonial black. Beneath the sleeve of his coat, the obsidian oath band had become a web of crimson fractures. Each pulse sent pain through his arm, yet he no longer looked at the wound. His eyes remained fixed on the great doors waiting to open. Edmund Harrow stepped beside him. "History remembers kings who carried impossible burdens," he said quietly. "Not kings who surrendered to compassion." Silas answered without looking away. "Perhaps history has remembered the wrong things." Before Edmund could reply, the great doors opened. Nathaniel escorted Adeline into the vast chamber, then stopped several steps behind her. He did not push her forward. He simply released his escort and stepped back. The choice to continue belonged to her alone. Adeline looked toward the towering throne, then briefly toward the distant exit behind her. She could still run. No chain held her. No hand forced her onward. She thought of her mother's letter, of the frightened servant girl, of every forgotten woman whose name had vanished into silence. Slowly, she drew a steady breath and walked forward by her own will. The instant her foot crossed the circle of ancient stone before the throne, a deep vibration rolled beneath the floor. Hairline cracks of pale silver light spread quietly across the black rock, weaving outward like roots beneath frozen earth. The silver ribbon and clasp around Adeline's wrist grew warm, answering something hidden deep within the mountain. Every conversation ceased. Every noble stared in stunned silence as the ancient throne, untouched for centuries, seemed to awaken, not with violence or judgment, but with quiet recognition. No voice spoke. No miracle revealed the truth. Only a single heartbeat echoed through the hall, ancient, slow, and unmistakably alive. Silas felt the fractured oath band tighten painfully around his wrist as he looked at Adeline standing alone within the spreading silver light. In that silent moment, he understood with perfect clarity that the next choice would belong to him. And once it was made, neither his crown nor his kingdom would ever be the same again. The ancient heartbeat rolled through the throne hall once, then fell silent. No voice followed it. No heavenly proclamation. Only a stillness so profound that every person gathered beneath the vaulted ceiling became painfully aware of their own breathing. Pale silver light continued spreading beneath Adeline Mercer's feet, tracing forgotten patterns across the black stone floor before stopping at the base of the throne of forgotten kings. It did not consume the chamber. It simply waited. Adeline stood motionless inside the circle of light, her white ceremonial gown stirring gently, although the air itself had become perfectly still. The faded silver ribbon and antique clasp around her wrist radiated a soft warmth against her skin. For the first time since entering Blackthorn Citadel, she no longer felt like someone being led toward death. She felt as though she had arrived somewhere that had known her long before she knew herself. Around the hall, uncertainty spread faster than fear. Nobles exchanged uneasy glances. Soldiers tightened their grip on their weapons without raising them. Even those who had demanded the sacrifice only hours earlier now hesitated, unsettled by the quiet recognition unfolding before them. High Chancellor Edmund Harrow alone refused to step back. His eyes remained fixed on the throne, his face marked not by cruelty but by desperation. "Do you not understand what is happening?" he asked the court, his voice carrying through the silence. 3 centuries of peace were purchased because our fathers obeyed these laws. If we abandon them now, every family in this kingdom will bear the cost. No one answered. Edmund looked toward Silas instead. "Your Majesty, if you refuse today, and North Vale falls tomorrow, every life lost will rest upon your conscience." For a long moment, Silas said nothing. The fractured obsidian band around his wrist throbbed with relentless pain, each crimson crack reminding him of every king who had come before him. He could still choose obedience. He could preserve tradition. He could allow history to continue exactly as it always had. His gaze slowly shifted toward Adeline. She met his eyes without pleading for rescue. She had already made her own choice when she walked into the circle willingly. She was afraid, yet she stood with quiet dignity, asking nothing from anyone. In that instant, Silas understood the truth that had followed him since he opened the forgotten archives. The greatest burden of a king was not choosing between mercy and duty. It was recognizing when duty had been separated from justice. Theodore Hale stepped forward, his lantern casting a warm glow across the ancient floor. "Your Majesty," he said softly, "every generation inherits traditions. Not every tradition deserves another generation." Edmund turned sharply. Enough. His composure finally fractured. He drew the ceremonial blade resting beside the throne, the polished steel catching the silver light. "If the crown refuses its duty, then the council will fulfill it." Gasps echoed through the chamber as he advanced toward Adeline. Nathaniel Brooks instinctively reached for his sword, but the startled crowd blocked his path for a crucial heartbeat. It was enough. Edmund raised the blade. Adeline did not run. She closed her eyes only for a moment, drew one steady breath, and lifted her chin. Before the blade could fall, Silas crossed the distance between them. He stepped directly in front of her and caught the descending strike with his own arm. Steel crashed against the obsidian oath band. A deafening crack echoed through the hall. The black stone circling Silas's wrist splintered beneath the force, crimson fractures racing across its surface before the band exploded into countless fragments. Blood ran freely down his hand, yet he never stepped away from Adeline. The broken pieces struck the silver-lit floor and dissolved like ash carried away by the wind. At that exact moment, the throne of forgotten kings awakened. A brilliant silver radiance flowed through every crack in the ancient stone, illuminating the hall from within rather than above. The throne itself did not demand sacrifice. It answered sacrifice freely chosen by the one who possessed power. One by one, luminous figures emerged from the light, forgotten kings and queens whose faces matched the faded portraits lining the palace walls. They looked neither toward Edmund nor the assembled council. Every one of them turned first to Silas, still standing before Adeline with his wounded arm lowered at last. The eldest among them stepped forward. His weathered face carried sorrow, compassion, and quiet pride in equal measure. When he spoke, his voice was neither loud nor threatening. It was simply undeniable. The first oath of a worthy ruler was never written upon stone. His gaze rested upon the shattered remains of the obsidian band. It was written upon the heart. As those words echoed through the chamber, the forged covenant scrolls lying upon the council table faded to blank parchment before everyone's eyes. The lie that had ruled North Vale for generations vanished without flame or violence, unable to survive the truth any longer. Edmund slowly released the ceremonial blade. It slipped from his trembling hand and struck the floor with a hollow clang that echoed through the silent hall. Around him, nobles lowered themselves to one knee, not before ancient tradition, but before the courage they had just witnessed. Adeline stepped beside Silas and gently took his injured hand into both of hers. She did not speak. She did not need to. The pain on his face eased as their eyes met, and for the first time since the ancient heartbeat had awakened beneath the mountain, the throne hall felt less like a place built to judge the living, and more like a place where truth had finally found its way home. For several long moments, no one inside the throne hall dared to speak. The silver radiance that had filled the chamber gradually softened, settling over the ancient stone like the first snowfall after a brutal winter. The shattered remains of the obsidian oath band had vanished, and with them disappeared the invisible weight that had ruled Blackthorn's citadel for generations. Alpha King Silas Ashcroft remained standing beside Adeline Mercer, though the strain of breaking the false oath was written across his face. Blood still stained his hand, but the fierce pain that had haunted him for days was slowly giving way to something unfamiliar: peace. Around them, the translucent rulers of old watched in silence. They did not demand praise. They did not ask for vengeance. One by one, they lowered their heads toward the young king, as though acknowledging not his crown, but the choice he had made when every easier path had led elsewhere. Then, like mist touched by morning sunlight, their forms dissolved into countless threads of silver light that drifted upward through the vaulted ceiling until only the quiet glow surrounding the throne remained. No one present would ever again be able to claim the forgotten kings had hungered for innocent blood. The truth had revealed itself before every witness. Edmund Harrow stayed on his knees, staring at the blank pages that had once carried the forged covenant. His hands trembled as the empty parchment slipped from his grasp. For the first time in decades, certainty abandoned him. "I believe," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. "I believed I was protecting them." Theodore Hale approached slowly, stopping beside the fallen chancellor. His voice carried neither triumph nor condemnation. "Fear often disguises itself as duty, Edmund. That is why every generation must choose compassion again." The old chancellor lowered his head. He offered no defense, because none remained. Nearby, Vivian Holloway removed the jeweled crest of House Holloway from her cloak. She walked across the silent hall and placed it upon the cracked stone before Adeline. "My family helped preserve those lies," she said quietly. "I cannot change what they did, but I can choose what comes next." Adeline looked at the crest for a moment before gently returning it to Vivian's hands. "Then let it remind people of courage instead of pride." Vivian closed her fingers around the emblem, tears filling her eyes as she nodded. Across the chamber, Nathaniel Brooks ordered the guards to open the great doors of the throne hall. Cold morning air swept inside, carrying with it the sound of distant bells from the city below. Palace servants gathered hesitantly outside, uncertain whether they were witnessing the end of a kingdom or the beginning of a new one. Instead of hiding the truth behind sealed walls, Silas looked toward Nathaniel and gave a simple instruction: "Bring everyone." By midday, nobles, servants, soldiers, craftsmen, and villagers stood together inside the vast hall. No rank separated them. No curtain concealed the ancient throne. Silas stepped forward, his injured hand still wrapped in white linen. "For centuries," he said, his voice steady enough to reach every corner of the chamber, "this kingdom believed mercy was weakness because powerful men taught us to fear it. Today that fear ends." He turned toward the rows of forgotten names newly uncovered within the old archive ledgers. "Every woman whose story was erased will be remembered. Every family denied the truth will receive it. And no child born in North Vale will ever again be taught that innocence is a curse." No applause followed. The silence that answered him was deeper than celebration. Many wept openly. Others bowed their heads, grieving people whose names they had never known until that day. Adeline stood quietly among them, holding the faded silver ribbon her mother had once worn. She walked to the ancient throne and gently tied the ribbon around one of its weathered stone arms. It was neither an offering nor a farewell. It was a promise that those who had been forgotten would remain forgotten no longer. As her fingers released the ribbon, a soft breeze passed through the hall, although every door stood still. The silver light surrounding the throne faded into a gentle warmth, calm and untroubled, as if the old guardians had finally laid down a burden carried for centuries. Silas stepped beside Adeline, neither reaching for her hand nor speaking. They simply stood together in the quiet that followed truth. Outside, sunlight finally broke through the clouds, spilling across the towers of Blackthorn Citadel and into the valleys below. For the first time in living memory, the bells ringing across North Vale did not announce sacrifice, mourning, or war. They announced remembrance. And as the people slowly left the hall carrying both sorrow and hope into a new day, Theodore looked toward the restored throne with a peaceful smile. "Now," he murmured to himself, "the kingdom may finally begin the story it was always meant to tell." Winter sunlight poured across Blackthorn Citadel with a warmth the ancient fortress had not known for generations. The crimson banners that once announced ceremonies of sacrifice had been taken down, replaced by simple white standards bearing the crest of North Vale alone. The throne hall stood open from dawn until dusk, no longer guarded by fear or hidden behind sealed doors. People entered quietly, not to worship the throne, but to remember the cost of allowing fear to become law. Adeline Mercer crossed the familiar hall carrying the weathered archive ledger Theodore Hale had entrusted to her. For weeks, she had worked beside scholars, servants, and village elders, restoring the names of every Omega woman whose story had been erased. One by one, forgotten daughters, sisters, and mothers returned to history. None would disappear into silence again. Theodore watched from the edge of the chamber, his lantern resting unlit beside him. "The archives no longer belong to a keeper," he said with a gentle smile. "They belong to the people." Adeline closed the ledger carefully. "Then they'll never be hidden again." Outside, The great courtyard filled as families gathered for the first day of remembrance. No offerings were carried through the palace gates. Instead, children placed white flowers beneath a newly carved memorial honoring those who had been sacrificed in the name of a lie. Vivian Holloway stepped forward before the crowd and removed the jeweled crest of House Holloway from her cloak. Rather than wearing it over her heart, she laid it beside the memorial stone. "My family helped preserve fear," she said quietly. "From this day forward, let our name help preserve the truth." No applause followed. The silence that answered her carried forgiveness, more powerful than celebration. Nearby, Nathaniel Brooks oversaw the royal guard as soldiers opened every entrance to the throne hall. Their orders had changed forever. They no longer protected secrets hidden behind stone walls. They protected the people who walked through them. Alpha King Silas Ashcroft addressed the gathered kingdom only once that morning. His injured hand had healed, though the obsidian oath band was gone forever, leaving only a faint silver mark around his wrist. "A kingdom is not measured by the traditions it refuses to question," he said. "It is measured by the courage to correct them when they are wrong." His words were brief, and when he finished, he stepped down from the dais instead of remaining above the crowd. It was a small gesture, yet everyone understood its meaning. That afternoon, Adeline returned alone to the throne of forgotten kings. The faded silver ribbon and the antique clasp that had belonged to her mother still rested upon one carved arm of the ancient seat. She touched them gently, then smiled as a quiet breeze drifted through the open hall. The throne remained silent. It no longer needed to speak. Its purpose had been fulfilled. Soft footsteps echoed behind her. Silas stopped beside her, not as a ruler summoning an audience, but as a man sharing a moment of peace. "The council has asked whether we'll hold a coronation for a queen," he said with a faint smile. Adeline looked toward the open doors where sunlight spilled across the stone floor. "And what did you tell them?" "That crowns mean very little if they're placed upon someone who never chose them." He met her eyes. "Whatever future you want, it should begin with your own voice." For a moment, she simply looked at him. Throughout her life, others had decided where she belonged, what she was worth, and what she must sacrifice. This was the first future that had ever been offered instead of demanded. She reached for his hand. "Then I choose to stay," she said softly. "Not because this kingdom needs saving, but because it deserves the chance to become something better." Their hands met, not as a promise born of destiny, but as one freely given. Together they walked toward the open courtyard where laughter drifted through the winter air. As they crossed the threshold, a little Omega girl, no older than 7, ran into the palace after a white flower slipped from her hands. She paused when she saw the king, instinctively expecting fear or punishment. Instead, Silas bent down, picked up the flower, and returned it with a warm smile. The child accepted it without trembling. Her mother hurried over, thanked the king, and gently took her daughter's hand. Before leaving, the little girl looked up at Adeline and smiled back with the easy confidence of someone who had never been taught that her birth made her a curse. Adeline watched her disappear into the crowd, and quiet tears filled her eyes. She realized that this was the true ending of the story, not the breaking of an ancient oath, nor the fall of a false covenant, but the simple certainty that another innocent child would never have to walk the path she once had. High above Blackthorn Citadel, the bells rang across the valleys once more. Long after that winter had passed, mothers no longer frightened their children with stories about the throne of forgotten kings. Instead, they told them about the Alpha King who chose justice over fear, and the young Omega who answered hatred with compassion until an entire kingdom remembered what true strength had always been. And because two people refused to surrender their humanity, the throne that had once been feared became a place where hope, rather than sacrifice, was finally remembered.